Thank you very much for an informative, enlightening, and even encouraging speech. That you're an optimist became immediately clear when you described climate change policy as a playground at the beginning, and that's the first time this metaphor came to mind, or this description. We like to think of it typically as a battleground, as a battlefield, where many interests clash. But I think the essence of your talk was also to say they don't necessarily have to clash. They can find, if they're enlightened and smart enough middle ground to cooperate. And I think, if I may say so, that was also one of the outcomes of the Darndorf Symposium in November, where we had various politicians here that made similar arguments. So I think the whole dialogue, the whole way we refer to climate change has changed, and I think it has changed for the better. So thank you for being an optimist, and thank you for relaying that message to us this morning. We have some time for discussions, for Q&A, and what I would like to do is just field the questions from here, and we will first of all take them one by one, but if we see we can also group them, we will do so. The gentleman in the front here first, and then we have two in the back. There you go. Yes, probably best if you use a mic. There should be a microphone. Because we can hear you, but the people in the back won't hear you. That's the reason. And if you maybe just introduce yourself.
Yes.
Very briefly.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Limburg. I'm Vice President of the European Institute for Climate and Energy, shortly EICE. And I would like first to thank you. I have the opportunity to listen to you, and I join you in being an optimist. But I'm not an optimist due to climate change. I'm an optimist to mankind's behavior to overcome every problem. You started your speech, impressive speech, with a number of claims which I really don't get, and which are contradicted every day by natural observations and by political observations. You name, for example, that no country is going out of the process of negotiations. I just can name 4: Canada, perhaps Russia, Japan, Australia recently. So people are getting fed up, all these information regarding climate change and the 2 degrees political issue. You just asked to say, believe me, carbon dioxide is making the temperature of the world. It is not. The last 17 years, there's no increase in any temperature, but the increase of carbon dioxide is going faster every day. And lastly, I would like to mention that carbon dioxide was in the history of Earth much, much bigger in the atmosphere than it is today. It is a wonderful fertilizer for plants, and even the plants are suffering hunger from getting too little carbon dioxide. But what I'm interested mostly is the IPCC.
Oh, all of those weren't questions.
No, not a question. It was just statements. The IPCC
which we disagree about, but we'll just go ahead.
Don't consider the thousands of scientists, Earth-related scientists, for this Earth sciences, which are completely opposing the opinion of the IPCC, and more than 1,000 peer-reviewed papers are published, which have any showing up, any evidence in the IPCC reports, AR5 or AR4 or what have you. Why is it that way? That's my question.
I think these were at least 3 questions, actually. If you just want to take them, and then we go to the 2 gentlemen.
Go ahead. Well, I'll collect.
Do you want to group them? Yeah. Then we just add it YouTube. Yeah.
I'm Sabrina Schulz. I'm head of office of E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism here in Berlin. Thank you so much for your encouraging words. I now know yet again what I'm getting up for every morning. And should I just add, I'm so glad that the climate deniers debate is essentially over in this country, and I'm really grateful for that. I would like to push you a little bit on the politics, because this is something that really still needs to happen in this city. The European Commission has just published its white paper, and the European Union seems to be coalescing around a consensus. 40% of greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2030 would be enough. Now, in your view, is this really enough as a, let's call it, diplomatic offer collectively by the European Union when they go negotiating, when they go and negotiate in Paris next year? Is 40% enough to buy us the credibility? And if yes, why? If not, what needs to happen on the side of the European Union to become, yet again, more of a leader in climate change? And what role do you see for the German government in this process when it comes to pushing everyone a little bit more?
Thank you. And the gentleman next to you.
Christian Flaxland from the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. So first of all, thank you very much for the enlightening presentation. You invoked the picture or the framing of the climate problem as a global commons problem, where we have this budget that we need to observe in order to attain a 2-degree stabilization goal. I think this is a very useful framing, but there are 2 ways of, or 2 points I would like to make about it. The first thing is that, of course, the major problem is the fossil fuels underground, that we have so much more of these than the atmospheric deposit space that we have available. So in terms of gigatons CO2, we can deposit about 1,000 gigatons of CO2 more in the atmosphere. We have 15,000 in the ground, at least. And we have exploration in fossil fuels, fracking, oil exploration, oil boom in Africa perhaps coming. And this has important implications on the story about renewables also, because fossil fuels will get cheaper, and they will get even cheaper as renewables are becoming implemented and the demand decreases. So in order to tackle that, we probably need some carbon pricing to raise the price of carbon fuels essentially, which of course is the major political economy problem of climate mitigation. But there may be interest of the nation states to introduce such carbon pricing, for example, to finance their public debt or finance infrastructure investments. So this may be one way of reframing the carbon pricing argument. So this is more of a comment, sorry. And the second thing, I think the budget approach is very useful analytically, but I wonder if it's useful as a negotiation strategy, because it's essentially a zero-sum game that you engage in. And if you envisage a targets and timetables approach for the next agreement, or is this going to be a policy coordination agreement where you, for example, coordinate carbon prices?
I think we have 3 quite substantive questions, and we would like to ask you to respond, and we open up another round.
Thank you very much. Sir, you belong to a species about to go extinct. So to your 4 points, the 4 countries that you have named are countries that have stepped out of the Kyoto Protocol, have not stepped out of the 2015 agreement. They are square and centered there. And they step out of the Kyoto Protocol for mostly political reasons that I think are understandable. The so-called flattening of temperature over the past decade is absolutely there, but I wish I had a board here to explain something, but let me use this. Can you help me out? This is where temperatures were last decade. This is where temperatures were the decade before that. And if I had another thing here, voila. This is where temperatures were the decade before that, okay? So yes, there is a flattening of temperatures across the decade. That is not the point. The point is that there is a trend that goes up, because it's not about every day's temperature. It's not about every year's temperature. It's about the trend. And the trend is absolutely there to be worried about, not just to be considered. It's to be worried about. So that, to my friends who say, oh yeah, well, the decade. And we all know that that temperature is being absorbed by the oceans, and that is leading to acidification, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's actually also not good news. The IPCC. The IPCC reviewed for the 5th assessment report, they reviewed over 6,000 peer-reviewed publications, all the peer-reviewed publications that there are on climate, every single one of them. There is not one peer-reviewed publication that was not reviewed by the IPCC. They also answered 50,000 queries, all of these scientists, and they still came out with the very clear conclusion that climate change exists and that it is human-induced. And to the concentration of CO2. I would like you all to take one breath. Just breathe in. And now tell me what you've done. You have done something that has never been done by anybody in the history of this earth. You have just breathed in 400 parts per million of CO2 into every breath that you take. That has never occurred, ever. So we are at concentrations that have never occurred during the history of mankind, and all the scientists concur, and I am glad that you disagree, but you can ask your colleagues. If you're a scientist, please do ask your colleagues. I'm not a scientist. 40% EU. Let me say this. I think it's a good start. I think it's a very good start, and the EU Commission put that announcement out very early from the point of view of the negotiations, which is countries need to come forward with their targets somewhere between now and the first 3 months of 2015. So the fact that the EU already puts a first flag out and says 40% plus 27% renewables, et cetera, I think it's a good start. I'm confident that that is not the end of the line. Because I also think that the EU needs to see what is the United States going to do, what is China going to do, which is probably going to take the most aggressive targets of everybody. But I think that once that is clear, and certainly once we have elections in the EU, I'm confident that the comparison of the different efforts will lead the EU also to increase their targets, because what is very clear is nobody is doing enough right now. I mean, it's not just about EU. Nobody is doing enough. Everybody needs to do more. To fossil fuels underground, absolutely concur. About 2/3, if not 3/4 of the fossil fuels that we have need to stay underground. That is a major, major task, because as we know, there are heaps of money invested in those fossil fuels underground, and they will have to stay underground. To say nothing about fossil fuel subsidies, by the way, which you didn't mention, but fossil fuel subsidies will also have to be restructured. And I'm currently, interested in the thought, well, how could one restructure fossil fuel subsidies instead of being used for the production and consumption of fossil fuels? Could you actually divert them into accelerating carbon capture and storage, which is a technology that you have to develop in order to be able to support the hydrocarbons that will be in the energy mix over the next 20 to 50 years. But I also agree with you that carbon pricing, if it were possible. Now, I come from an absolutely privileged, wonderful little country that has had a carbon price for quite a few decades, and there are a few countries that have a carbon price. It may surprise all of you that the country that is most aggressively moving into carbon pricing is China. China has already 5 operating carbon markets in 5 cities that are larger than almost than the European Union. I mean, the sizes in China are just incredible. And they have 2 more carbon markets coming on, and by 2016, they will have a national carbon market. So by the time you have China with a national carbon market, that will truly be quite a signal of a carbon price that many other countries, I think, will be following. But aside from that, you also have, independently of China, you have 17 countries that are pursuing national, domestic level carbon markets, including, well, in Latin America, Costa Rica, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, and then you have Vietnam, you have ¿quién más está en Asia? Vietnam, you have Korea, nobody in Africa moving. Oh, South Africa beginning to think about it. So you do have a total of 17 countries that are already beginning to figure out how do they place themselves into this. And it's not an international carbon market yet, carbon price, but it does begin to populate with data points what the carbon price could begin to be. And finally, I completely agree that the carbon budget, as I have explained it, the 800 and the 500, is not helpful at the political level. because it is a zero-sum game, and that is not the way you want to pit one country against the other. The reason why I use it here is because I think it's a very helpful concept to understand the depth of this challenge. We're not playing house. This truly is a very, very deeply political and physical problem that we're dealing with here. So that's why I share it, not because it's not a part of the negotiations. It's the first time the IPCC in their 5th assessment reports was the first time that they put those numbers out. It's not a part of the negotiations, and I don't think it's helpful at the political level. But just to understand what is at the bottom of it, that is what is at the bottom of it.
Thank you very much. We open a second round, and I think the mic is said that you were first, and I'd like you to be concise and remember that brevity is a virtue. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Susanne Ehlerding. I am with the online magazine Klimaretter.info. It means Climate Saviors. And on the way to Lima, we have an important event. This is the Ban Ki-moon Summit, 23rd of September. And I would like to know, the Secretary General invited a big number of governments, economic leaders, NGOs. They will all be in New York. And I would like to figure out how the process of pledging and how does Ban Ki-moon think to come forward and have good output at that day.
Thank you. I think I saw Inge Kaul and then Stephen Nye in the back, and then we have time for another round after that. Thank you. Inge?
Thanks very much, Inge Kaul, Hertie School of Governance. Thanks for your optimism. I share your optimism. I think we will have an agreement. However, will the agreement be a typical UN agreement where we state ambitious goals, where we probably have some indicators for the monitoring process, but then there is a missing middle? The industrial countries will keep mum about transfer of resources and transfer of technology. So will we then, by compulsion more or less, have to go the private good road to climate change mitigation, that we just have green cars, green building materials, green everything? And will this add up fast enough?
Thank you, Inge. And Stephen in the back. Yeah. Thank you.
Jacobs University, Bremen. Thank you for your inspiring speech. Thank you for your optimism on the glum February morning. However, I'm half English, so pessimism is my game. And being half English, half German, I think a lot about failure. And how, and I'd like you to speculate about failure. How could one, seriously now, how could one fail constructively in 2015? How could we set up a process in which failure becomes a chance, an opportunity to learn, fail forward, as the tech startups say in the Beta House?
Thank you. So 3 questions, one about the upcoming event with Ban Ki-moon. Then how would it be different? And how can we fail successfully? Thank you.
So about the Secretary General's summit, it's actually a very welcome event. The Secretary General has invited all the heads of state, of government, and CEOs of corporations to come forward with what he calls bold announcements, bold commitments. What he would like to do is to begin, to put an incentive and some pressure, both carrots and stick, for everybody to go home and do their homework. Because one of the things that was decided in Warsaw is that countries go home and do their homework, which is they do the economic analysis that they need to do in order to be able to know how much can they contribute to ambition in the short term, and how much can they put on the table. So his invitation is sort of, when it's the equivalent of me coming home at 6 p.m. and asking my girls, so have you done your homework? Because otherwise there's no dinner. That's the same thing that the SG is doing. So he is asking them, have you done your homework? What are the results? Some countries will be able to come with their results, some will not. But he's also inviting, as you have pointed out, the corporations and the finance sector to come forward with what they are considering, which is also will all be very good information. From the negotiations perspective, because that's not a negotiation, from the negotiations perspective, we're very grateful for that invitation from the Secretary General, because it begins to give us some sense of where are people going to come in. What are the numbers going to be, and what are the conditionalities, if any, going to be? So it's a very good curtain raiser, I would say, for the negotiations of next year. On the agreement, I do agree with you that that it is one of the pieces that is most hanging back is what is the finance and technology support that the industrialized countries are going to give to developing countries. And for the reasons that I have just explained, it's absolutely crucial. Now, having said that, I'm also completely convinced that the public sector as a whole does not have the funding that is necessary for this transformation, because the International Energy Agency has conservatively assessed that what we're going to need is $1 trillion per year over the next 20 to 30 years. That is not funding that is available in the public sector. So what we're going to have to do is they will have to come forward with public funding, but that public funding is going to have to be used very smartly and very strategically to de-risk the investment that will come from the private sector, because it's in their own interest, but it needs to get over the hump, over the tipping point into low carbon, and it has to be de-risked. So there's going to have to be a combination of the two. Although my last name ends with F, I actually never pronounced the word that you pronounced. And you know why? Because I have children. And you all have children, you have nieces, you have nephews, some of you have grandchildren. None of us can look ourselves in the face if we actually do not succeed. I think actually that Copenhagen was the most important example of having a not successful, hugely productive meeting. Hugely productive. I have learned more from Copenhagen than I've learned from anything else in my life. And it's certainly helping governments to do things very, very differently now. And I think there are enough lessons learned, both about the need to combine the bottom up with the top down, because in Copenhagen we did everything top down. It's not going to work. We need to combine the top down and the bottom up in order to be able to get us back on track. But what that also means is that the agreement, to come back also to your question about what needs to be in the agreement needs to be able to harvest everything that is going on already on climate change, of which there is a lot, but it also needs to delineate the trajectory of carbon emissions over the next 50 years. Because if we're not able to do that, then we have an insufficient agreement. So that, I think, is the most difficult part of that agreement, and that is the part that makes the planetary boundary of what the planet will be able to hold, makes it visible in the agreement text and in a way that is doable, in particular for developing countries, because they're the ones that are going to be most pressed.
Thank you. Just allow me to follow up with a question of my own that resonates with what Inge Kaul said. On the way to Lima, how do you see the role of NGOs evolving? Will they be different? The Greenpeaces of the world, what would you ideally like them to do?
This is the year of the NGOs. This is absolutely the year of the NGOs, because Lima will be a COP, but before the COP, we will have a pre-COP, which we always have, which is the last big political push before a COP. But this year, the pre-COP is going to be in Venezuela. And Venezuela has decided that they are going to actually structure the whole pre-COP around civil society. So they're already organizing hundreds and hundreds of civil society representatives that are going to go to Lima, that are going to add their voice to this. And it's going to be a very, very different type of pre-COP because of the engagement of Venezuela. So if there was a year in which NGOs truly have the opportunity to stand up and raise their voices, this year.
Well, we have a number of NGO representatives there, so they should be happy to hear that. Let's open a third round of questions. The lady here, and then the gentleman in the back, and then the gentleman there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Clara Cerqueira from the Embassy of Brazil here in Berlin. I thank you very much for your optimism, but during your words, you've said that you are very certain of the agreement, that the agreement will be in 2015, but you still have doubts about the quality of the agreement. I was wondering if you could go in a little further in this quality question. And the second question is about the Munich Security Conference. If you could comment on that for us that had not the chance to see it yet. And what's your opinion of a theme like climate change that's originally from a very different forum of the Munich Security Conference? I mean, you have a multilateral forum at the one side, and a very traditional North-oriented conference on the other side that's now has taken interest in a theme such as climate change. So I'm very interested in how this relate and how good that's it that this interest is for the multilateral system and its construction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman there, yes.
Hi, my name is Michael Schneider. I'm a trainee of Bread for the World, and yeah, the press currently revealed that the USA spied out at climate negotiations in Copenhagen, and I guess it was not the only time. So my questions are, how does this affect your optimism? And how do you think this will affect the climate negotiations when there's lots of more mistrust? Because I think that this is going to have an impact.
Sorry, can you repeat what is the this in your sentence?
About the NSA and the climate negotiations. I guess you have heard of it.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. And the next question is gentleman right there. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. My name is Philipp Strothmann. I'm with the UNFCCC Lifecycle Initiative. First of all, I would like to thank you for your very optimistic talk, which gives me a little bit of hope. My question is a little bit to the political dimension of the process, and in specific, because the young gentleman over there mentioned the United States, and you did so earlier in your talk, seeing that Obama is sort of a lame duck in a political system which is a bit deadlocked with Congress, that out of, I think, 55 laws that he asked for, only signed up 2. And given the Byrd-Hagel resolution, which essentially only allows Congress to pass or to sign up on any global agreement if China commits. China's on a very good way, but the American Congress seems to be increasingly more reluctant, and the people sitting in that Congress to jump on the climate train, if you will say. So my question really is, even if the Obama administration were to sign the agreement hopefully in Paris, how do you see its implementability with regards to the Congress, which essentially has to sign up on it?
Thank you.
Right there.
So I think we take them in threes, and then we have a final round after that. Thank you.
The quality of the agreement, actually my concern about the quality of the agreement is basically the argument that I put in my talk. I am relatively certain that we will have most, if not all, countries coming forward with what they can do, but the sum total of that is completely insufficient. We know that. We know that everything that people are seeing right now, the visibility that they have into what they can contribute is completely insufficient. So yes, we're encouraging to come to the SG summit and to, do their homework, and but what the atmosphere sees is that there's a huge gap between what countries can do and where we need to be. So it's important for them to put their contributions, because what it does is it begins to build a sense of confidence that we're all going to partake in this in some way. If that is the only thing that the agreement does, then it is sadly insufficient. That's why I said that the agreement needs to also be reflective of the planetary boundary and remind us all that everything that we're going to be doing over the next 5 or 10 years is a good down payment toward what we have to do, but is only a down payment. We have to raise our eyes toward the final target, where we need to be by the second half of the century. The Munich Security Conference was, of course, on the one side, about all of the very pressing issues that we have on the security front, Ukraine, Syria, on down the line, DRC, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the conference needs to deal with that. But what was very impressive is that it was also about the longer term risks. And just from the climate perspective, it's very clear that certainly the US military and the UK military are probably taking the lead in analyzing the systemic risk that climate poses from a military perspective. And I would say it's actually my conclusion from that is two things. A, the cost of military operations. In the face of declining budgets of the military and prolonged presence of military in other countries, they're really having a hard time dealing with the costs. In particular, if you just take, one data point. In Afghanistan, the United States pays $1 per gallon for fuel and then spends $400 transporting that fuel to where they need it. So the transportation of fuel is killing them. In the UK, 1 gallon of fuel moves an aircraft carrier a whopping 12 inches forward. So the cost of fuel and the cost of transporting the fuel is absolutely killing the military operations, particularly because their budgets are coming down. So they understand that they need to move toward renewable energy, not because they want to save the planet, okay, but because they understand that it is the cheapest way for them to get energy where they need it on their operations without having to transport it. They can go to distributed renewable energy and they can have safer and cheaper energy that they will have to back up, obviously always with some fuels, but that they don't have to depend only on the delivery of fuels. And the second big issue that they discuss is displacement, human displacement. So currently we have 200 million people displaced over the world, displaced both internally but also internationally. So that's sort of the sum total of immigration right now. And we don't have hard data of how that is going to grow with climate change, but the margins that we have is either 25 million more or 1 billion more. Well, that's a huge margin, right? But even if you look at the 1 billion, that you say, oh my God, that's totally exaggerated. Well, maybe it's not so exaggerated, because with climate scenarios, we know that we will have 5 billion people in water-stressed areas by 2030. So if you have 5 billion people living in water-stressed areas, that you have a sizable portion of those already migrating out is probably not a terrible exaggeration. So for both, and displacement, of course, places a huge strain on national security. So for both of those reasons, the military are now looking at climate change and what they can do. On NSA, yeah, so I saw that they were all, listening to what we were discussing in Copenhagen. I mean, unfortunately, not terribly much creative was discussed in Copenhagen, so I think they wasted their investment there. And if anything, if they have access to that, then maybe all other 190 countries should have access to the same thing and spy on each other. Or rather, they can just sit around a table and talk, which is what they should be doing. And, spying on each other is just completely unhelpful. But I don't think, I think there's many more important things that are actually leading to confidence building. Not that I think that we're there, but we're moving in that direction rather than the whole spying thing. On the United States, you know, one of the fortuitous things about lame duck presidents is that all of a sudden they have much more political flexibility than they did before. And I am fully convinced that President Obama intends to use that. He can't use Capitol Hill because they're not with him, but he can certainly use his executive power. And he really is leaning a lot on EPA, on the Environmental Protection Agency. He's leaning on the Department of the Interior, and he's leaning on the Department of Energy to move forward with a certain set of measures, each of them that actually in total will move the United States forward on climate change, in addition to the fact that he is using Secretary Kerry to be very, very conversant with China and figure out where are the sectors in which the United States and China can move together. For example, on HFCs is probably the place where they're going to be moving together most effectively, and perhaps even on carbon capture and storage. So he's definitely using his executive power much more than Capitol Hill. Eventually, Capitol Hill, you know, once they realize that it's kind of dumb to let the Chinese take over all the new technology, and what about the United States is actually losing competitive to China, they may come on board. But I do think that he's going to be using, and I already see evidence that he's using his executive much more. Whether the 2015 agreement has to go through very traditional ratification processes in the United States or elsewhere remains to be seen. Everybody's fully aware of that problem, and everybody's thinking about how do we manage that such that it will not become a damper.
Thank you. I think we're both optimists, Christiana, but I have reason for concern this morning because here we are into the final round of questions, and we have yet to have a question posed by a Hertie student. And we have an unwritten rule at a Hertie school that we can only conclude events like that if we have at least one student ask a question. One courageous student. And there we are. And then we have the gentleman to my left. And perhaps we get a second courageous student. Back there, I see quite a number of them. But you go first. Thank you.
It's working now. I'm Carlos Salgado. I'd like to ask you, I am EMPM student. I'm from Latin America as well, from Brazil. And I'd like to know more on the development of the Green Climate Fund, if you could develop more on the new issues. Thank you very much.
The gentleman on.
Thank you very much. My name is Chiti. I'm the ambassador of Zambia here in Berlin. And I do recall coming over to meet you. I paid a courtesy call on you last year, and you promised to come to Berlin. And I'm glad that you're here. You made your speech very interesting. Perhaps my question, coming from a developing country, is not only for you to, again, look at the climate fund, because you talked about the decoupling of development from CO2. And in the past, as you know, pledges relating to funds have not been forthcoming. What makes you so confident this time around that, in fact, the partners will find it in their interest to ensure that the developing countries do get the finance, do get the technology, so as to get to this issue of the 2 degrees? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. One final question. Yes.
Well, good day. My name is Anne-Marie Cortas. I'm a student here also at the Hertie School in the MPP program. And I have a question also about the issue of growth. So we've heard a lot about the agreement and the political side, but I was wondering, what do you think can developing countries do to really change the growth, to really change the pattern and not to be dependent so much on the industrial countries? Especially considering, well, if the agreement will be signed and they say, well, this is what we can do, But we all know that industrial countries come through the back door, come through trade agreements, and will still put a lot of pressure on developing countries to include their technology. So what do you think can developing countries, maybe even especially smaller countries, do to overcome this pressure and to really, you know, initiate their own green growth? Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Let's see, actually all interrelated questions. The Green Climate Fund is currently a house under construction. And it has a board, and it has finally its permanent secretariat in Songdo, Korea. But it is still under construction with respect to the business models that they're going to be using, with respect to the governance. The governance is clear. With respect to the business models, with respect to the criteria that they're going to be using for projects, with respect to a whole bunch of operational issues that still need to be defined. The target date for the clarification of all of that and for decisions of all of that is the end of May. So by the end of May of this year, the board that is constituted and operating does have to finalize all of those issues. And once those are all finalized, then that is when, in exchange, so to speak, for finalizing all of that, that is when they start to go into their capitalization phase. So the timeline that exists for the Green Climate Fund is they finalize in May. They begin to go out and put their capitalization documents on the table. And it is expected that the first capitalization of the Green Climate Fund will occur on the 23rd of September during the SG Summit. That is when several countries are actually currently thinking of making their first announcements. Doesn't mean that the money will necessarily flow on the 23rd of September, but it does mean that those who are running the Green Climate Fund expect some initial capitalization announcements to come on the 23rd of September. That is not going to be enough. And it's very clear that needs to continue the process, but any new institution needs to prove itself. So once they get their first funding, they will have to go through the first wave of investment plans that are presented to them. And they're going to have to figure out how are they going to blend all of these instruments, because it's very clear that they will not be able to attend to all of the needs from developing countries through the money that is going to go in through the GCF. So they're going to have to blend GCF with several other financial instruments, but still be, as I call it, the tail that wags the dog. 100 billion is nothing compared to the trillion a year that need to go in, but if the GCF does its work well, they can actually be the tail on the dog and point the investment in the right direction, which is in the investment of clean technologies. So all remains to be seen, but at least we do have this year the prospects of very concrete progress with the GCF. Whether the industrialized countries are going to come through with their promise or not, I cannot imagine any scenario under which they won't, because they know that that is so fundamental to the 2015 agreement. And they know that if they want one single developing country, of which there are 130, to be on board, they have to come through. So, my sense is that they are, it's not exactly the right time to be talking to industrialized countries about money, because they're all rather broke right now. But they understand that this is not a short-term thing, this is a long-term commitment, and they understand that that commitment is on the table and that there is full expectation, not just from developing countries, there's full expectation from the world that they're going to be doing this. How they're going to be doing that and with what speed and at what level still remains to be seen. But I think there is full awareness of the fact that that is a very, very fundamental part of the agreement. And to green growth, some of the technologies that will be used for green growth, some of them are owned by corporations in industrialized countries, but some of them are owned in developing countries. So India, for example, and China are both countries that have really invested a lot in these technologies, and that that will be the owners of the technologies themselves and will be deploying these technologies. It doesn't mean that they're the only ones, but it does mean that they are seeing that that is the way to go. Whether you call it green growth or whether you call it responsible growth, many people get sort of hung up on the term. What is important is actually to be able to provide the funding, the technology, and the political support for developing countries to be able to decouple. But that's not something that I'm saying. That is a realization. The industrialized countries know that that is what this is all about. And they may drag their feet and, you know, et cetera, but they know that that is the crux. And they know that that is the only way that they're going to move forward. So I'm actually pretty stubborn. I don't take no for an answer. So I'm expecting them to come forward.
Thank you so much for coming to the Hertie School this morning. Christiana, that was very, very, very good of you. I know you have a very, very busy schedule. I'd like to thank you all for coming to the school and for the students to participate and even to ask 2 questions. It was good in the end that saved the day for the school. So once again, I think we should have a round of applause for Christiana and her team. Thank you.